Hey friends, tonight we step into one of the strangest years in all of recorded history. A year so unsettling that even people who were already used to hunger, war, and cold winter stopped, looked at the sky and whispered, something isn't right. I'm talking about the year 536, often called the worst year to be alive. But before we dive into the shadowed chapter of the past, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket, or let a fan hum softly in the background. This story is not just about facts and dates. It's about what it felt like to live through a time when the very sun seemed to abandon humanity. Picture yourself in the early 6th century. You're not a king or a general. You're someone ordinary, a monk in a cold stone monastery, a farmer hoping the barley grows, or a traveler carrying goods along a muddy road. Life is simple, maybe hard, but it has a rhythm. The sun rises, the seasons turn, and even through struggles, there's a pattern you can trust. Until one morning in 536, the sky is different. At first, it's just a haze, a muted grayness that makes dawn feel longer than usual. You shrug it off, but then days pass, weeks pass, and the light never returns to normal. The sun glows faintly, like a candle flickering behind smoke. By noon it feels like twilight, and by twilight, you wonder the sun is even still there. Historians of the time, not people given to exaggeration, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness. Chroniclers from Ireland to Constantinople noted a strange, dry fog that covered the earth. It wasn't mist, it wasn't smoke. It was something else, a veil that refused to lift. Imagine looking up, expecting warmth, and finding only a pale disk in a colorless sky. And with the dimming came the cold. Crops faltered. Seasons lost their rhythm. People whispered of angry gods, of curses, of omens written in the heavens. They had no science to tell them about volcanoes or dust in the stratosphere. All they knew was that the world they trusted had broken, and no one could say when or if it would be whole again. Tonight, we'll walk through that year, through the fear, the hunger, the silence of a sky gone wrong, not as distant observers, but as companions to the people who lived it. So let's begin. The year is 536. The sun has dimmed, and the world is holding its breath. The siege of Acre. Let's drift forward in time, leaving behind the strange darkness of the year 536, and arrive in the warm winds of the late 12th century. The world has changed, yet people remain much the same, still dreaming, still fearing, still clinging to faith in the middle of hardship. It is the year 1189, and the Mediterranean Sea carries with it the scent of salt, tar, and smoke. On its coast stands the city of Acre, a place of narrow streets, tall walls, and bustling harbors. By day, ships rock gently in the harbor. By night, the lamps of fishermen shimmer on the waves. For centuries, Acre had been a doorway between worlds. Merchants from Italy, pilgrims from France, sailors from Egypt, all brushing shoulders in its markets. Whoever held Acre held more than stone walls. They held the pulse of the Holy Land. But now Acre is surrounded, and the world waits. When people speak of sieges, they often imagine fire and fury, walls shaking, armies clashing, trumpets blaring. Yet most of a siege is not thunder. It is waiting, long, slow days where time itself feels heavy, where nothing seems to move except the smoke rising from distant fires. The siege of Acre was like this, stretched not across weeks, but years. And in that long encirclement, life settled into a rhythm that was neither peace nor war, but something in between. Picture the scene. On the plains outside Acre, rows of tents stood like stubborn weeds, enduring the salt wind from the sea and the dust that blew in from the hills. They had been there so long that they no longer looked temporary. Paths had been worn into the earth between them, as if the ground itself accepted this strange, lingering town. Men knew where the baker set his fire, where the smith hammered iron, where the merchants, yes, there were always merchants, sold wine or cloth or herbs brought in from ships. Morning came slowly, with the pale light spreading across both camps, Crusader and Muslim, each staring the other across fields of churned mud and broken earth. The city walls of Acre loomed in the distance, weathered now by countless assaults, yet still standing. From the towers, banners fluttered defiantly. Sometimes you could hear the distant call of a muezzin drifting faintly across the no man's land, mingling with the tolling of a crusader bell. For a moment, it sounded almost like two prayers meeting in the same sky. But most days were quiet. Too quiet. Soldiers woke, stretched aching limbs, and looked at the same view they had seen yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. Acre did not fall. Acre did not yield. And so the encirclement dragged on, a slow tightening of patience rather than of ropes or chains. Waiting is not gentle work. It wears at the spirit as much as hunger wears at the body. Men grew restless. They sharpened weapons not because they expected battle, but because they needed something to do with their hands. They drilled in the dust, marched in circles, argued over dice games. Some carved small crosses into wood. Others scratched the names of loved ones into stone. Boredom pressed down like a second armor, heavy and unshakable. And yet, within that monotony, small rituals emerged. At dusk, when the day cooled, fires flickered to life across the fields. People gathered in circles, knights, squires, cooks, children, pilgrims who had come chasing miracles. They shared thin stews, passed skins of wine, sang songs from their distant homelands. A Breton tune might rise from one corner, answered by a German drinking chant from another. Languages mixed and overlapped, weaving a tapestry of sound that was rough but strangely beautiful. Seasons turned, marking the encirclement more clearly than any victory or defeat. The rains came, soaking tents until they sagged with water, turning the ground to mud that sucked at boots and wagons alike. Then the heat followed, pressing down in waves, making armor feel like a furnace and bread turn hard within hours. Winter brought frost that glittered on the field at dawn, and men huddled close to the fires, sharing cloaks and stories to ward off the cold. Time passed, measured not by progress at the walls, but by the turning of the earth. The city within suffered too, though unseen. From time to time, a desperate sortie broke forth, defenders charging out, clashing with the besiegers before retreating behind their gates once more. From the walls, shouts echoed, arrows hissed, stones thudded into the earth. But after the clash came silence again, long and heavy. The people in the city and the army outside lived in the same cycle of hunger, hope, and exhaustion, divided by stone yet bound together by the slow grind of waiting. Ships were the lifelines. Every sail on the horizon brought whispers through the camp. Was it a relief fleet? Supplies for Acre? Reinforcements for crusaders? Men would climb dunes or scramble onto makeshift watchtowers, straining their eyes to see whose banner snapped in the wind. Sometimes cheers erupted as Christian allies disembarked. Sometimes groans followed as Muslim reinforcements slipped through the blockade. The sea was never silent, and each new arrival stirred the weary encirclement like a stone dropped into still water. And always there was death, not the quick death of battle, but the slow kind, illness creeping to the camp, fevers that carried men away in the night, hunger that hollowed cheeks and dimmed eyes. Graves multiplied on the edges of the field, marked with simple wooden crosses, or, sometimes, with nothing at all. Yet even here, tenderness lingered, a comrade laying a cloak over a shivering friend, a priest murmuring prayers as he held the hand of a man slipping away, a child leaving flowers on a mound of earth. The encirclement was not only an act of war. It was a test of endurance, of how long the human heart could carry on in the shadow of uncertainty. What is most striking, looking back, is how ordinary life continued amidst extraordinary. Women washed clothes in the streams, spreading them on bushes to dry in the sun. Bakers kneaded dough with patient hands. Children laughed as they chased dogs between tents. Lovers whispered in the dark. And through it all, the city stood, the camp endured, and the long encirclement stretched on. It is easy, from a distance of centuries, to see only the armies, the kings, the clash of steel. But if you pause and listen closely, you will hear something quieter, the rhythm of daily life, hearts beating steadily through the long wait. And perhaps that is the true story of Acre. Not only the moment when the walls finally fell, but the long, weary years when two worlds faced each other, unmoving, and ordinary people carried on, thread by fragile thread, in the endless twilight of the siege. Between two armies. When we think of two armies facing one another, the mind often imagines banners snapping the wind, drums beating, warriors glaring across a narrow field, waiting for the clash. But at Acre, the reality was slower, quieter, and more human. Between two armies there stretched not only a strip of earth, but also a strange, fragile thread of connection, a silent acknowledgement that though they wore different symbols, spoke different tongues, and prayed in different ways, they were bound together by the same long wait. The Crusaders camped in their sprawling city of canvas, wood, and smoke. Across the lines, within acre stone walls, the garrison and townsfolk endured their own vigil. From a distance, they looked like opposites, besiegers and besieged, but if you could walk unseen between them, you might notice how alike their days became. In the Christian camp, a trumpet might sound at dawn, rousing men to drills or patrols. Armor clinked, horses stamped, the air filled with the smell of bread baking on open fires. Priests carried crosses, offering blessings for the day ahead. And across the walls in Acre, the call to prayer drifted from minarets, echoing in the gray morning. Men gathered to pray eastward, women lit fires in courtyards, children fetched water from wells. The rhythms of devotion and daily life beat like a steady drum on both sides, two faiths rising together with the sun. Between these armies lay a land scarred by waiting. The no-man's land was littered with broken arrows, burned-out siege engines, and the shallow graves of men who had fallen in sudden skirmishes. Yet most days it lay silent. Birds still crossed it, wind still stirred the grass, and sometimes at night, the sounds of laughter or song drifted faintly from one side to the other. There were clashes, of course. Sudden bursts of violence shattered the stillness. Arrows rained from the walls. Stones crashed down from catapults. Knights charged forward with banners flying, only to retreat again when the gates held fast. But such moments were like storms, fierce, destructive, and brief. Then came the long stretches of calm, when soldiers leaned on spears and stared at distant figures who were also staring back. And in that staring, something subtle took root. Curiosity, perhaps. Recognition. For what soldier, seeing the outline of another man across the walls, did not wonder if he too longed for his home, his family, a warm meal after endless rations? The banners were different, but hunger was the same. Cold was the same. The ache of waiting was the same. Merchants and sailors, ever practical, sometimes crossed this divide. Despite orders and odes, there were whispers of quiet exchanges. Wine for spices, cloth for grain, gossip traded along with goods. War is fierce, but commerce is stubborn. In those brief, forbidden transactions, the lines blurred. A coin passed from Christian hand to Muslim palm was more than a trade. It was a reminder that life still sought a way, even here, even now. On both sides, stories were told by firelight. In the Crusader camp, tales of saints, of distant homelands, of hopes for Jerusalem yet to come. In Acre, stories of prophets, of ancestors, of victories past. Yet the themes were familiar. Courage, loss, endurance, the yearning for protection from powers beyond human reach. Two languages, two traditions, but the same need to make sense of hardship through words spoken in the dark. Sometimes, when night was still and the sea quiet, sounds carried strangely clear across the lines. A hymn sung softly by weary crusaders might be heard by defenders on the wall. And perhaps, in turn, the melody of a Muslim lullaby drifted out of the city, reaching ears that strained to catch its notes. Neither side would admit it, but music softened the walls more than stone throwers ever could. The seasons touched both armies without discrimination. Rain fell on both. Heat baked both. Winter chilled both. The same moon hung above them. The same stars wheeled overhead. Men on opposite sides of faith and cause lifted their eyes to the same constellations, wondering if their families far away saw the same sky. And so the long standoff was not only a clash of weapons, but also a quiet mirror, reflecting each side back to the other. Between two armies, a strange empathy grew. Not strong enough to stop the war, but strong enough to remind each soldier that his enemy was not a shadow, but a man. The fields of Acre bore witness to this paradox. Hatred flared, yes, and swords were drawn. But in the pauses, in the hours between assaults, there was something almost like kinship, a shared endurance of time itself. Siege was not only about breaking walls, but about breaking patience. And in that slow breaking, Men glimpse the truth that their foes suffer the same trials, carried the same burdens, and long for the same end of the waiting. Between two armies, silence became the greatest teacher. It showed that war is not only about battles fought, but about the space in between. The waiting, the watching, the recognition of shared humanity in the face of hardship. And perhaps that is why Acre lingered so long, neither side yielding quickly. For when you see your enemy not only as a foe but as a reflection, the war itself becomes heavier, more complex, and infinitely harder to resolve. A soldier's night. Night in a besieged camp is not always silence. It begins with a hush, yes, but that hush is threaded with a small, familiar sound to life continuing against the backdrop of war. Imagine yourself as a soldier outside the walls of Acre, sometime in the long years of siege. The sun has dropped into the sea, painting the horizon with fading gold. The day's labors, hauling stones, mending walls, sharpening blades, have ended. Now the night spreads its cool breath over the weary camp. You sit near a fire, its glow flickering on the faces of men who become almost like brothers. Their armor lies beside them, glinting faintly in the firelight, no longer heavy on their shoulders. The air smells of smoke, of salted meat roasting, of bread warming on flat stones. For a moment, it almost feels like a village evening back home, if one can forget the city walls looming in the distance and the watchful silence of those who live inside. A soldier's night is a patchwork of duties and stolen comforts. Some draw lots of the watch, climbing the rough earthworks to keep their eyes fixed on Acre's gates. They scan the shadows for movement, for a sudden flare of torches that might herald a sortie. Others take their ease, curling beneath cloaks, listening to the murmur of prayers rising with the smoke. There are stories told, too. One man speaks of his farm, of the vines he left behind, how they must be heavy with grapes by now. Another whispers of a child born while he has been away, a son or daughter he has not yet held. Their voices are soft, not to wake those already sleeping, but also because the night itself seems sacred, too delicate for loudness. Around them, the camp becomes a chorus of murmurs, snores, the low clink of a pot being moved closer to the coals. And beyond the campfires lies a deeper quiet. The no-man's land between armies becomes a sea of shadow, broken only by the occasional spark of torchlight from Acre's walls. The defenders there keep their own watch. Sometimes, if the wind is right, you might hear them, the faint rhythm of drums or the haunting call to prayer rising like smoke into the starry sky. It is a strange reminder. While you lie here waiting, so do they. While you think of home, so do they. The enemy, too, has families, memories, longings. Sleep comes unevenly. For some, exhaustion pulls them down quickly, dreams carrying them away from the damp earth and restless tension. For others, sleep is shallow, broken by the cries of sentries or the far-off bark of a dog. There are men who lie awake for hours, staring at the stars. The constellations above Acre are not so different from those seen over Europe. Orion still strides across the sky, and the moon still hangs in silver silence. Looking upward, a soldier might feel for a fleeting moment that he is home again, watching the same sky as loved ones also see. Yet there are darker moments, too. Night brings fears that daylight keeps at bay. What if the siege never ends? What if reinforcements fail to come? What if illness sweeps through the camp? In the stillness, doubts creep in, and men shift restlessly, clutching small tokens of faith, a cross, a relic, a scrap of cloth from home. These objects, worn and fragile, become anchors in the storm of uncertainty. But then, dawn always comes. The soldier rises with aching limbs, brushing dirt from his cloak, pulling armor back onto weary shoulders. The fire has burned down to embers, the stars fade, and the first light of morning spills across the camp. The night has passed safely, and that is a victory in itself. Another day begins, another step deeper into the long story of the siege. A soldier's night at Acre is a fragile balance, between fear and comfort, between exhaustion and endurance, between the nearness of comrades and the distance of home. It is in these quiet hours, perhaps more than in battle, that the heart of the siege can be felt. For wars are not only fought in moments of clashing steel. They are endured in the waiting, in the restless nights, in the quiet breath of men who hold fast beneath the stars. And as you drift with him into the rhythm of sleep, you realize history is not only grand banners and famous names. It is also this, an ordinary man, wrapped in a cloak against the night air, gazing at the same moon you see now, hoping that tomorrow will bring him one step closer to peace. Saladin's presence. If the Crusader camp was the beating heart of one side of siege, then far to the south and east there pulsed another presence, steady and formidable, the shadow of Saladin himself. To speak his name was to conjure both fear and respect. To the Crusaders, he was a tireless adversary. To his followers, a leader whose very presence carried weight enough to sustain weary hearts. Yet Saladin was no phantom. He was a man of flesh and bone, walking the same dusty paths, breathing the same heavy air. His tent, though more richly adorned than most, was still canvas stretched against the sky. Lamps glowed within, casting gentle light over maps, scrolls, and letters brought by couriers who galloped through the night. In that tent, decisions were made, not always swiftly, for Saladin was patient. His strength was not in sudden fury, but in endurance, in knowing that time itself could be wielded as a weapon. For his soldiers, the knowledge that Saladin lingered nearby was a kind of anchor. Even when he was not visible, his presence was felt in the discipline of the ranks, in the way supplies were organized, in the calm words of officers who echoed his steady tone. Whispers of his movements passed like quiet prayers through the camp. The Sultan has ridden among the men, the Sultan has spoken with the wounded, the Sultan has ordered fresh dates and bread for the hungry. These small acts mattered as much as victories, for they reminded weary warriors that their leader saw them not only as fighters, but as human beings. At night, he sometimes rode along the lines, his figure outlined against the torchlight. Those who glimpsed him described not pomp or splendor, but simplicity. His robe was plain, his demeanor calm, his voice carrying a warmth that steadied trembling hands. To see him was to remember why they endured this endless siege, not merely for land or walls, but for faith, for dignity, for the promise of something greater than themselves. Saladin's presence reached even further, into the hearts of the people within Acre. Letters carried his assurances, promising relief, reminding them that they were not abandoned. And though months stretched into years, that belief, that the Sultan watched, planned, and waited, was enough to keep hope alive behind the walls. Strangely, his influence touched the Crusaders too. They cursed his name, yes, and feared his cunning. But there was also admiration, reluctant though it might be. They spoke of his generosity toward captives, of his restraint where cruelty might have served him. Some even whispered comparisons between Saladin and their own kings, weighing virtues and failings in the quiet of the night. For in the long stillness of the siege, men had time to think, to reflect, and even to respect the humanity of their enemy. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Saladin's presence was its constancy. The Crusaders might take heart when fresh ships arrived in port, when new banners appeared over their camp. But such moments came and went. Saladin remained. His patience was a tide that never receded. He could wait a season, a year, longer if needed. And in that endurance lay a lesson that history remembers. Sometimes victory is not in the clash of swords, but in the steadfastness of spirit. So when we imagine Acre, we must picture not only the clash of the walls or the crowded camps, but also this quiet force hovering just beyond the horizon. The Sultan whose steady presence shaped every decision, every heartbeat, every hope. His men slept easier knowing he watched over them. His enemies lay awake, uneasy, knowing the same. And in this way, Saladin became more than a man. He became a kind of rhythm, a pulse that echoed through both armies, binding the long siege together with his patience, his humanity, and his unyielding will. Within the city walls, behind acre stone defenses, life carried on in fragile rhythms. To look from the outside, the walls stood tall and unyielding, but inside was a city adapting, bending, yet refusing to break. Each morning, the market stirred to life. Merchants laid out what little they had, small baskets of grain, a handful of dried figs, a threadbare cloth that once might have been part of a colorful display. Coins still changed hands, but barter was often the true lifeline. A measure of oil for a few onions, a loaf of bread traded for salt or fish. Scarcity reshaped not only trade but trust, and neighbors leaned on one another more than ever. Mothers queued at wells, drawing water under the watch of weary guards. Children ran errands with baskets clutched tightly in their arms. Their voices quieter than in more carefree days, but not silent. Old men gathered in courtyards to trade whispers, rumors of Saladin's movements, speculation about the Crusader camp, and stories meant to steady one another's hearts. Above them, soldiers kept watch along the ramparts. From there, the enemy camp stretched endlessly across the horizon, a sea of tents and smoke. The standoff became a silent conversation. Crusaders staring at the walls, defenders staring back. Neither side spoke, but both understood the weight of those long gazes. Faith gave the city its heartbeat. Mosques and churches alike filled with voices, prayers of protection, for food, for endurance. For some, faith was a plea for victory. For others, simply the strength to see another sunrise. These moments of worship stitched courage into the fabric of daily life. When bread and oil alone could not, evenings brought a softer rhythm. Lamps flickered in the narrow streets, and families gathered around modest meals. Lentils, bread, sometimes fish from the sea if fortune allowed. Children still laughed in snatches of play. Neighbors still shared songs or hummed lullabies. Siege could darken the skies, but it could not silence the small comforts of human warmth. Yet hardship was never far. Food stores dwindled. Illness crept into crowded quarters. Healers worked tirelessly, rinsing wounds with dwindling water, praying as much as they treated. Each cough or fever was a reminder that the siege was not just fought with swords, but with hunger, sickness, and time. Hope arrived now and then by sea. When sails appeared on the horizon, cheers echoed from the docks. Ships carried grain, weapons, and fresh soldiers who stepped ashore to lift spirits as much as defenses. Those moments were like rain falling after drought, short-lived but deeply cherished. And so, Acre endured. The people learned to live alongside fear, making it part of their days until it became almost ordinary. Behind the walls was not only a fortress, but a heartbeat. Thousands of souls rising each morning with a quiet resolve to say, "We are still here." The kings arrived. By the summer of 1191, the siege of Acre had already stretched on for years. Soldiers in both camps had grown tired. Their armor dulled not just by battle, but by waiting, by hunger, by endless days that seemed to roll into one another. The city's walls still stood, its defenders still defiant, and the Crusader camp around it still restless. But then came whispers, first in uncertain tones, then with growing certainty. The kings were coming. News traveled like a warm current across the weary camp. From tent to tent, men spoke of sails on the horizon, of royal banners soon to be raised. The thought alone seemed to stir energy back into tired limbs. For so long, they had been led by lords, barons, and commanders. But kings carried not just armies but hope. The first to arrive was King Philip II of France. His ships cut across the sea with practiced elegance, their sails taut in the wind. As they approached Acre's battered harbor, French knights stood proudly at the rails, their armor polished to catch the sunlight, a rare sight after so much gray. When Philip set foot upon the shore, the camp came alive with cheers. Trumpets sounded, and for a moment the weary soldiers remembered what it felt like to believe. Philip was not a man of flamboyant gestures, but his presence alone carried weight. He walked through the camp with a quiet dignity, speaking to commanders, inspecting fortifications, and reminding everyone, without needing many words, that France itself now stood behind the siege. Supplies, reinforcements, and the promise of renewed determination followed him. Not long after came the king they had been whispering of for months, Richard the Lionheart of England. His journey had been long and fraught with storms, delays, and the dangers of the sea. But when his fleet finally appeared, it was as though the horizon itself had caught fire with sails. Dozens of ships, filled with soldiers, horses, weapons, and food, rolled toward Acre like an unstoppable tide. Richard himself stood tall on the deck of his flagship, the English banner rippling above him. To those watching from the shore, he seemed almost larger than life. The stories of his valor had already spread. How he fought with the strength of 10 men, how his courage inspired even the faint-hearted. Now, here he was, not a tale or rumor, but flesh and blood, stepping onto the sands of the Holy Land. The Crusader camp erupted in celebration. Trumpets, drums, and shouts mingled into a roar. Soldiers who had trudged for months under sun and hardship lifted their heads with pride. Merchants who had been calculating dwindling profits began to dream of renewed fortunes. Even the sick and weary found reason to rise from their beds, if only to glimpse the Lionheart with their own eyes. For the defenders inside Acre, the sight of two kings arriving in swift succession carried a different weight. From the walls, they could see the banners of France and England now fluttering beside the older standards of lesser lords. It was a reminder that the siege was no longer a matter of stubborn nobles and weary knights. It was a matter of kingdoms. The fight had grown larger than Acre, larger than any one city. And yet, the arrival of kings did not immediately break the stalemate. The walls of Acre still loomed. Saladin's forces still watched from beyond. The sea still brought hunger as often as it brought supplies. But there was a shift, subtle yet undeniable. Where before the camp had moved with the slowness of despair, now it hummed with anticipation. Plans were redrawn. Engines of war were rebuilt with greater vigor. The sound of hammers and saws carried through the night, punctuated by the chants of priests blessing the renewed cause. For the common soldier, it meant something simpler. It meant that their suffering had not been forgotten, that the kings of distant lands had sailed across oceans to stand beside them. Around campfires, stories flowed, each one grander than the last, of what victories would now follow. The French boasted of Philip's strategy, the English of Richard's ferocity. Together, they believed the city could not stand much longer. But kings brought more than hope. They also brought rivalry. Whispers of tension between Philip and Richard began almost as quickly as the cheers of their arrival. The men watched as the two monarchs exchanged polite courtesies, each careful, each weighing the other. Both wanted glory. Both wanted to be remembered as the king who broke Acre. And so, beneath the surface of unity, a quiet contest began to stir. Still, for the moment, that rivalry was a distant concern. What mattered most was that Acre no longer felt like a forgotten siege. It felt like the center of the world. With two great kings now present, every soldier believed they were standing on the edge of history. And so, as the sun dipped low and torches lit the camp, the Crusaders went to sleep with a new kind of restlessness. Not the dull ache of despair, but the charged anticipation of battle soon to come. Acre's fate had not yet been sealed, but the stage had shifted, and the world would remember that night, the night the kings arrived. Aftermath. When the dust of Acre's surrender finally settled, the city did not rest. It breathed, it shifted, and it carried the marks of 2 long years of struggle. But outside those walls, far beyond the weary soldiers and silent streets, the fall of Acre was already rippling outward, shaping politics, emotions, and dreams of what was yet to come. For the Crusaders, victory at Acre was more than just possession of the city. It was proof that their fractured cause could still yield triumph. For years, the Crusades have been haunted by division. Lords arguing, kings hesitating, soldiers leaving in despair. Now, with Acre in their hands, there was a rallying point. The banners of France and England fluttered together, and even though their kings had their rivalries, Acre became a symbol of shared achievement. Letters were carried across the sea, to courts in Paris and London, telling of the hard-won victory. In villages and monasteries, the news spread like a spark. The crusade lived again. Yet unity was fragile. Within the Crusader camp, rivalries simmered. King Philip of France, weary from illness and wary of Richard's rising fame, soon prepared to leave for home. Richard, fiery and restless, remained eager to press onward toward Jerusalem. Their soldiers, though bound by the same cause, felt the tension between their leaders. Around the campfires, men whispered disputes over spoils, over rights, over who should command. Acre had been won, yes, but beneath the triumph, the old crack still showed. For Saladin, the fall of Acre was a bitter blow. He had carried the weight of expectation, that he, the great defender of Islam, would not allow the city to fall. Yet even he had been unable to break the Crusader lines. From his tent, he watched as Acre's banners were lowered, as hostages were taken, as prisoners were marched away. He must have felt the sting of helplessness, the pain of knowing that his soldiers and citizens had endured so long only to surrender at last. But Saladin was not a man easily broken. To his followers, he urged patience and resolve. Acre was lost, yes, But Jerusalem still stood, and so he turned his gaze southward, preparing for the battles yet to come. Inside Acre itself, life began to change in quiet, jarring ways. Streets once patrolled by Muslim guards now echoed with the steps of Crusader soldiers. Markets reopened, but the voices speaking were different. Churches were cleansed and reconsecrated, while mosques stood silent or were repurposed. For the citizens who remained, there was a sense of disorientation, of waking to find the world suddenly altered. Some tried to adapt, trading with the new rulers. Others grieved quietly, remembering the city that had been theirs. The stones of Acre had not moved, but the spirit of the city had shifted forever. Beyond the city, the surrender set the stage for what would follow. The Crusaders now held a crucial port, a lifeline for supplies and reinforcements. From Acre, they could plan their march south, with Jerusalem as their shining goal. Ships arrived with fresh troops, merchants with goods, pilgrims with prayers. The siege had drained them, but victory gave them purpose again. Richard, especially, felt the fire of destiny burning brighter. He would not stop at Acre. His eyes were fixed firmly on the holy city. And yet, the aftermath carried shadows. The negotiations over prisoners, ransoms, and hostages became tangled and bitter. Promises made of surrender were delayed, and mistrust grew between Richard and Saladin. The lives of thousands hung in the balance, caught in the cold arithmetic of power. For those prisoners, the aftermath was not about politics or strategy, but about survival, about waiting and wondering if freedom or death would come. Emotionally, the fall of Acre left scars on both sides. For the Crusaders, it was a balm after years of hardship, but also deepened their hunger for more. One city was not enough. They longed for Jerusalem, and the victory at Acre made that longing sharper, more urgent. For Saladin's men, the loss was a wound, but also a call to unity. If Acre could fall, then no city was safe unless they stood together. In that way, the surrender hardened their resolve. Politically, Acre became a stage where kings and commanders measured one another. Richard's bravery and energy shone, earning him admiration but also envy. Philip's departure cast a shadow, reminding all that Crusader unity was never guaranteed. And Saladin's calm, even in defeat, maintained his aura of leadership. The world watched these figures, warriors and rulers whose choices would decide the fate of empires and faiths. But perhaps the deepest part of Acre's aftermath lay in the quieter truths. For ordinary soldiers, the end of the siege meant rest, nights without constant alarm, meals without the gnaw of hunger. For citizens, it meant uncertainty, but also an end to endless fear. For chroniclers and storytellers, it became a tale to carry forward, a moment to be remembered for generations. And for us, centuries later, it becomes a lens through which to see the enduring patterns of history, how triumph and tragedy intertwine, how one city can become the pivot of a vast struggle, how human endurance carries both glory and grief. The aftermath of Acre was not peace. It was not closure. It was the breath taken before the next great effort, the pause before the march southward. The Crusaders looked to Jerusalem. Saladin strengthened his defenses. Both sides knew that the true test still lay ahead. Yet for that brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, balanced between sorrow and hope, between the shadow of what was lost and the promise of what might yet be gained. And so Acre stood, scarred, changed, but alive. Its walls bore the marks of stones and fire, its streets the weight of footsteps both old and new. To some, it was a prize. To others, a grave. To all, it was a reminder that history is not written only by victories, but by the countless lives lived within their shadow. Echoes of Acre. Long after the banners were lowered and the last soldier stepped away from Acre's scarred walls, the memory of that siege lingered. It did not vanish with the smoke or fade with the passing seasons. Instead, it settled into the stories of both East and West, a memory heavy with sacrifice, stubbornness, and the strange, fragile persistence of hope. For the Crusaders, Acre was remembered as a moment when all seemed possible again. They had lost Jerusalem years before. Their cause had stumbled. And yet here was proof that victory could still be grasped. The songs sung in camps far from home told of Acre's fall, of kings who rode beneath its gates, of warriors who endured hunger and fire but did not yield. For many in Europe, Acre became not just a city on a map, but a symbol, a reminder that the crusade had not died. Pilgrims whispered its name with reverence. Chroniclers inked it into parchment so that centuries later we too would know. But for those in the Muslim world, Acre became a wound and a warning. Its loss was bitter, a reminder that even the strength of Saladin could not hold every stone, every wall. Yet in its bitterness lay resolve. To lose Acre was painful, but it also clarified the stakes. It stirred poets to write verses of endurance, scholars to reflect on faith in times of trial, and warriors to swear new oaths of loyalty. In its surrender, Acre planted the seeds of renewed defiance. What gives Acre its lasting echo is not only the clash of swords or the strategies of kings, but the human stories woven through its siege. The mother waiting behind walls for bread that never came. The soldier on a rampart staring across no man's land at an enemy who was also cold and tired. The monk who prayed for peace and instead found himself blessing the dying. These voices, mostly lost to history, with a quiet heartbeat beneath the thunder of war. And though we may never know their names, their endurance shaped the memory of Acre just as surely as any king's banner. Over time, Acre became a mirror to some. It reflected courage, the proof that faith and determination could wrest triumph from despair. To others, it reflected tragedy, a city battered, lives consumed, victory tainted by cruelty and mistrust. Like so much of history, it held both truths at once. Even centuries later, the name of Acre would not fade. The Crusader successors still spoke of it as a jewel of the coast, while Muslim rulers remembered it as a scar to be avenged. Its stones would see new rulers, new battles, new sieges, each layering fresh echoes atop the old. But always, the memory of 1189 to 1191 remained. The long encirclement, the kings, the surrender, the grief. And here, perhaps, lies Acre's truest legacy. It reminds us that history is not made only of victories or defeats, but of endurance. That even in the darkest sieges, people find ways to keep going, through hunger, fear, and doubt. That one city can hold within it the dreams of kings and the prayers of peasants, the clash of armies and the quiet courage of survival. When we think of Acre today, we are not only recalling a battle, we are listening to echoes, the distant voices of soldiers, citizens, kings, and chroniclers, each carrying a fragment of truth. They remind us that the past is not silent. It speaks, softly but steadily, across the centuries, asking us to remember, to reflect, and perhaps to understand. So as we close the chapter of Acre, imagine the city at twilight. The sea laps against its battered walls. The markets are quiet. The torches flicker, and in the hush of evening, the weight of history lingers in the stones. Acre does not forget, and in listening to its echoes, neither do we. Political, cultural fallout. When the dust finally settled around Acre, the city was not just a ruin of stone and bone. It was a mirror, reflecting back the fractured faces of Europe, the strange spirit of the Islamic world, and the strange, sometimes unexpected ways cultures rub against each other when locked in war. The fall of Acre was not an ending. It was a pivot, a turning point where politics, faith, and identity reshaped themselves in a long shadow of defeat and survival. The political ripples. When Acre finally fell and the banners of crusaders rose above its battered walls, the city did not simply surrender its stones. It released echoes, ripples that spread across kingdoms, deserts, and seas. The battlefield quieted, but in its place came a different kind of struggle, one of politics, pride, and patience. And these ripples, soft at first, would travel far, shaping the course of both east and west. For the Crusaders, Acre was hailed as a victory. Trumpets sounded, prayers rose skyward, and for a brief moment, men believed that God had smiled upon their cause. Yet beneath the hymns lay uneasy silences. To many, the triumph felt fragile, like a flame that might be snuffed out by the faintest wind. Acre had fallen, yes, but Jerusalem, the true heart of the quest, remained beyond reach. And within the ranks of Europe's nobility, unity was already unraveling. Richard of England stood tall, his presence a mix of iron and fire. He had fought with courage, led with brilliance, and secured his legend in the eyes of soldiers and storytellers alike. Yet his fire was difficult to stand close to. Richard's confidence often spilled into arrogance, and allies who once marched proudly at his side now felt the sting of his pride. Leopold of Austria, slighted and humiliated, nursed wounds to both honor and ambition. Philip of France, weary of endless squabbles and perhaps weary of Richard himself, turned his sails toward home. Victory, it seemed, had left them more divided than before. In Europe, the ripples of Acre were no less tangled. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the holy triumph, urging more nobles to take the cross. Yet kings and princes, hearing these words, weighed them against their own ambitions. Would they truly march for God, or would they return home to guard their thrones, to plot, to scheme? Even as some knelt in prayer, others whispered in council chambers, measuring the gains and losses of their rivals. The crusade, meant to unite Christendom, had instead become a mirror reflecting its many fractures. Across the sea, in the courts of Cairo and Damascus, the fall of Acre carried a different weight. For Saladin, the loss was bitter, but it was not defeat. He had fought with courage, rallied his people, and shown that even against a combined might of Europe, the Islamic world could endure. To his followers, Acre was not the end of hope, but a lesson that the Franks were fierce, but their unity was thin, their loyalty easily frayed. If one king quarreled with another, if patience outlasted pride, then time itself might be the greatest ally. Leaders in the Muslim world began to see war not only as a clash of swords, but as a test of endurance. The Christians might take cities, but could they hold them? Could they feed their armies, soothe their jealousies, and sustain their cause when home was so far away? The ripples of Acre whispered that perhaps they could not. And so plans were laid quietly, patiently, fortresses strengthened, alliances nurtured, and hope planted like seeds for the future. And then there were the common people, both Christian and Muslim, caught in the wake of these ripples. To them, Acre was not a symbol in chronicles, but a scar upon their lives. Families displaced, homes destroyed, markets disrupted. The city's fall carried grief as well as pride, sorrow as well as story. Yet even in their suffering, they too became part of the larger current that Acre had set in motion. The ripples of politics are rarely straight lines. They bend, twist, and collide just as the sea collide with the harbor walls. In Acre's case, those ripples carried with them both promise and peril. For Europe, the promise of renewed fervor and the peril of division. For the Islamic world, the sorrow of loss and the strength of patience. And for history, a reminder that victories are never simple. They do not end with trumpets or treaties. They unfold slowly, quietly, in the rivalries of kings, in the endurance of peoples, in the waiting of time itself. So Acre's fall was not only about what was lost or gained within its walls. It was about the currents that spread outward, currents that shaped decisions, altered loyalties, and whispered of struggles yet to come. Like ripples in a still pond, the effects widened, soft but steady, until they touched distant shores, carrying with them the echoes of one city, one siege, one moment that changed the rhythm of a world. The cultural collision. When the gates of Acre creaked open and the dust of battle began to settle, what remained was not only the rubble of stone and timber, but also something more delicate, an invisible mingling of worlds. For those swords had clashed and banners had flown in opposition, the city had, during those long years of siege, become a crossroads. And where roads meet, cultures collide, sometimes sharply, like flint against steel, and sometimes softly, like two rivers merging into one another. Acre, perched on the edge of the Mediterranean, had always been a harbor where east met west. Even before the Crusaders encircled its walls, merchants from Italy, Byzantium, and the Levant haggled in its crowded markets. But after the siege, when Crusader boots and Muslim sandals trod the same cobblestones, some as conquerors, others as captives or neighbors, the exchanges deepened. Within the city, languages mingled in the air. Latin prayers echoed in one quarter, while the lyrical call of Arabic merchants rang in another. Greek sailors muttered to one another at the docks, and Armenians bargained in the marketplace. For a traveler wandering through Acre's narrow streets, it was as though the world itself had compressed into a single city, noisy, colorful, and endlessly layered. And though mistrust lingered, suspicion in the eyes, grudges whispered in alleys, there was also a quiet inevitability to exchange. A knight, weary from battle, might taste spices he had never known: cinnamon, cardamom, saffron. He would carry their flavor home, retelling the memory at his own hearth. A Muslim artisan, left to ply his trade under new rulers, might carve stone in the European style, leaving arches and doorways that blended two traditions. Even prisoners carried culture. A captured soldier might sing a tune of his homeland, and in time, that melody might weave itself into another's memory, softened, altered, but alive. Trade, too, was a thread binding them together. Venetian and Genoese ships crowded the harbor, their holds filled with silks, glass, and sugar. Eastern textiles found their way into European wardrobes. In turn, Western coin and goods flowed eastward. It was not peace exactly, but commerce has a way of coaxing connection, even where politics breeds division. Ideas traveled as well. In dimly lit chambers, scribes copied texts, sometimes Arabic works translated into Latin, sometimes Christian writings passed into Muslim hands. Knowledge slipped through the cracks of war, carried by scholars, pilgrims, and merchants. A European physician might return home with notes on Arabic medicine. A Muslim chronicler might record details of Western siege engines. Neither side set out to share, yet the collision of their worlds ensured that learning could not be contained. There was also the subtler blending of daily life. Foods, fashions, gestures, all the small ways people express who they are, began to borrow from one another. A European soldier might adopt the light linen tunic of the locals to ease the burden of the sun. A Syrian trader might taste wine from the vineyards of France and find it curious enough to offer in his shop. Children, as they often do, bridge the gap most easily, playing the streets, picking up words from each other's tongues, weaving friendships beyond the barriers of faith. Of course, not all exchanges were gentle. The cultural collision of Acre was also marked by friction, by the pain of conquest and the bitterness of loss. Muslim families displaced from their homes carried sorrow, just as Christian families who had endured long exile carried longing. Yet even in grief, traces of each other lingered. A lullaby sung to comfort a child, a recipe carried to a new village, a story retold with accents borrowed from another tongue. These were quiet reminders that no wall, however high, could truly separate lives that it touched. In the years that followed, those who left Acre carried pieces of it with them. Pilgrims spoke of the markets glittering with lamps and silks. Soldiers told tales of strange fruits and fragrant oils. Merchants, practical and observant, returned with not only profits but with widened horizons. And so, long after the city's stones had absorbed the last echo of battle, its culture flowed outward, seeding itself across Europe and the Middle East alike. History remembers Acre as a fortress, a battlefield, a prize fought over by kings and sultans. Yet perhaps its deeper legacy is quieter. The way it served as a mirror where two worlds, despite their hostility, could not help but see pieces of one another. From architecture to medicine, from spices to stories, the city became a thread woven into the fabric of both East and West. And so, the cultural collision of Acre was not merely about conflict. It was about currents, subtle, persistent currents that carried with them the tastes, words, and wonders of different peoples. Like ripples meeting on the surface of water, they touched, overlapped, and in time, became impossible to separate. Acre's siege may have ended in fire and blood, but its memory lingered in the quiet blending of lives, shaping both sides long after the swords were sheathed. Faith and memory. When the dust of Acre finally settled and banners of victory fluttered where smoke had once hung heavy, what remained was not only broken walls and weary soldiers. What lingered, deeper, quieter, and far more lasting, was something carried in the hearts of those who had lived through it. Faith, memory, two forces as enduring as stone, yet far more difficult to conquer. For the men and women of the 12th century, faith was not an accessory. It was a compass of life, the rhythm of the seasons, the explanation for both suffering and joy. The siege of Acre, with its hunger, prayers, and unrelenting uncertainty, became a crucible where belief was tested daily. Imagine a crusader knight, his armor dented, his hands blistered from turning the crank of a siege engine. At night, when he finally found a quiet moment, he knelt in the mud and whispered the Latin prayers his mother had taught him as a boy. He was not only asking for victory, though that too, but for strength, for forgiveness, for the reassurance that his suffering meant something more than cold nights and endless waiting. The chapel tent in the camp, lit by trembling candles, was not grand. Yet for those who gathered there, it was a sanctuary in a world that had come apart. Across the battlefield, within Acre's walls, faith offered a different solace. Muslim families huddled together in courtyards, listening to the call to prayer echo faintly even amid the chaos. Each bow, each whispered recitation of the Quran was a reminder that even as walls crumbled, something eternal endured. Soldiers defending the city drew courage from the certainty that they were not alone, that their struggle had meaning beyond the clash of blades. It is easy to think of faith in such times as a weapon, a banner under which armies marched. And yes, leaders on both sides wielded it as such. Preachers in Europe thundered about holy wars, while imams in Acre urged steadfastness in the face of invasion. But for the ordinary soul, the farmer turned soldier, the mother with her children, the monk with his ink-stained hands, faith was gentler. It was a quiet assurance that tomorrow was worth facing, even if tomorrow seemed unlikely to come. And then there was memory. Battles end, but memories do not. They follow survivors home, etched in story and song. For years after Acre, pilgrims would retell what they had seen. The endless tents by the sea, the ships crowding the harbor, the nights when hunger gnawed louder than enemy swords. Some memories grew into legends, polished by retelling around hearths and in monasteries. Others lingered in silence, too raw, too painful, carried privately by those who had lost friends, brothers, sons. In Europe, memory of Acre fed both pride and sorrow. Priests praised it as a triumph of God's will, a moment when the faithful prevailed after long suffering. Yet among soldiers who limped home, or families who never saw their loved ones return, the memory was heavier, a reminder that victory always came at a cost. Songs were sung of kings and valor, yes, but also of famine and endless waiting. Children who had not been born when the siege began grew up hearing about it, as though it were a chapter of scripture, part history, part sacred story. In the Muslim world, Acre's fall was remembered with grief and resolve. Chroniclers wrote of betrayal, of hardship, of a city held bravely against overwhelming force. For them, the memory of Acre was not only about loss, it was a seed of determination. Parents told their children that the city would one day return to Muslim hands. The memory hardened into a vow, shaping generations that would rise after them. And as memory traveled, it did what memory always does. It shifted, softened, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes forgotten in details but never in feeling. For both sides, Acre became more than city. It became a symbol, a story told to explain not only what happened, but why it mattered. Faith and memory intertwined like threads in a tapestry. Together, they carried the meaning of Acre far beyond its ruined stones. They comforted the grieving, inspired the hopeful, and gave structure to what might otherwise have been seen as chaos. Centuries later, when chroniclers wrote of Acre, they wrote not only of walls and sieges, but miracles, visions, and prayers answered or denied. Faith turned history into something sacred. Memory ensured it would never fade. Perhaps that is why, even now, when we look back at Acre, we do not see only a battle. We see the human heart, searching for light in the dark, holding on to stories and carrying them across time. Faith and memory, two companions that walk beside us, long after the sword have rusted away. Legacies of Acre, long after the last banner was lowered and the echo of marching feet had faded from Acre's battered walls. The city's story did not end, like ripples on water. Its legacy spread outward, through kingdoms, across faiths, and into the quiet corners of memory, where history becomes something more than dates and battles. Acre was not just a place. It became a lens through which people saw themselves, their faith, and their future. For kings and princes of Europe, Acre was a reminder of both triumph and fragility. The city had fallen, yes, but only after years of unimaginable effort, hunger, and sacrifice. To rulers, it was proof that crusading could work, that distant dreams could be made real if only enough ships, soldiers, and silver were poured into the cause. Chronicles celebrated it as a victory blessed by God, a jewelry gained after long struggle. Yet beneath the triumph lay a quiet unease. The cost had been staggering, the unity fragile, and the sense of permanence uncertain. Acre was won, but at what price, and for how long? Among common soldiers and pilgrims. Acre became a story to pass down by firelight. Some spoke of endless camps stretched along the shore, of nights where prayers mixed with the sound of waves. Others remembered the hunger, the sickness, the fear of never seeing home again. Their legacies were personal, intimate, a scar carried on the body, a song sung in memory of a fallen comrade, a prayer whispered each year on the anniversary of their return. Acre was stitched into the fabric of their lives, a chapter that could never quite be closed. For the Muslim world, Acre's legacy was no less powerful. Its loss was mourned deeply, yet it also fueled determination. Chroniclers wrote of its fall not as an ending, but as a wound to be healed, a call to resilience. To the faithful, Acre became a symbol of perseverance against overwhelming odds, a reminder that even when walls crumble, the spirit does not. Families carried the story forward, telling children of brave defenders, of Saladin's dream that still lived, of a city that must one day return to its rightful place. In this way, Acre remained alive, through memory, through longing, through hope. But Acre's legacy was not only written in chronicles or preached from pulpits. It lived in quieter ways, too. It lived in the mingling of cultures, in the spices traded in the markets, in the songs that carried fragments of Arabic melody back to Europe, and in the carved stone that bore the marks of both East and West. The siege had been a brutal clash, yes, but in its aftermath, people still traded, still spoke, still lived together within those same walls. And in that living together, something new took root, a blending of worlds that neither army had intended, but which time patiently nurtured. There was also the legacy of lessons learned, though not always heeded. Leaders saw in Acre the danger of division, the fragility of alliances held together by little more than shared fear or ambition. Preachers spoke of perseverance and divine favor, while skeptics quietly noted how much depended on weather, coin, and chance. The siege reminded all who remembered it that history was not simply made by kings and generals, but also by ordinary hands, by farmers who left their fields, by sailors who braved the sea, by masons who built engines that shook walls apart. And perhaps most enduring of all was the emotional legacy, the sense that Acre mattered beyond itself. It was not just stone walls by the sea. It was a mirror of human longing, the longing to hold sacred ground, to prove faith through struggle, to write meaning into suffering. Centuries later, when other wars raged and other cities fell, people still look back to Acre, some as a symbol of glory, some as a warning, some as a story to whisper before sleep. When the world outside seemed uncertain, and the heart searched for anchors in the past. Even now, when we walk through the ruins of Acre, when we trace the worn stones with our hands, or look out across the same waters where ships once gathered, we can feel those echoes. The cries of battle are long gone. The banners have been taken down. But the legacies remain in faith, in memory, in story. Acre teaches us that places do not end when battles do. They continue, carried forward by all who remember them. And so, Acre lingers, not only in history books, but in the shared imagination of humanity. It whispers to us of resilience, of longing, of the fragile, enduring ties that bind people to both land and belief. Its walls may be broken, but its story is whole, and its legacy is still alive. Echoes through time. The nature of echoes. History does not end where the ink dries on a page. It lingers. It hums quietly, like the fading note of a bell long after it has been struck. The siege of Acre, brutal, drawn out, and deeply human, did not simply close with the fall of its walls. It left echoes, some soft, some thunderous, reaching far beyond the medieval age. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them still, brushing against our present lives like a draft through an open window. Imagine yourself standing in a vaulted cathedral, the kind whose stones were laid in those very years. You whisper a single word, and it rebounds again and again, fading a little each time, but never vanishing completely. That is the nature of history. It does not sit motionless, locked behind glass. It reverberates, reshaped by each generation that hears it, retells it, and finds meaning in its sound. The fall of Acre was, at first glance, a moment defined by armies, the weary crusaders finally breaking through, the defenders bowing to the inevitable, Saladin's forces retreating from the coast. But such an event is never confined to military maneuvers. It sent vibrations outward, into the halls of kings, into the markets of distant cities, into the imaginations of storytellers and pilgrims who had never touched its stones. These ripples, subtle yet persistent, remind us that no battle is ever fully over. It continues in memory, in politics, in the quiet spaces of human hearts. As the centuries passed, Acre became more than a place on a map. It became a symbol. For some, it was proof of divine favor and endurance. For others, a cautionary tale of greed, ambition, and fragile unity. Each listener to the echo heard it differently, much as one might hear different tones from the same ringing bell, depending on where one stands within the hall. And in those differences, entire cultures shape their identities, their faith, and their sense of destiny. Why, then, do we linger on echoes? Because they remind us that history is alive. It does not belong solely to scholars with dusty manuscripts or to tourists walking through ruins. It belongs to us all in the way we carry forward lessons, myths, and quiet warnings from those who came before. The men and women of Acre are long gone, their banners faded, their swords rusted, yet their choices, their hopes, and their suffering still ripple outward, touching our present like the faint shimmer of moonlight on water. So tonight, as you lie back and let the story unfold, listen for those echoes. They will not shout. They will not demand. They will arrive gently, like the sound of distant waves, guiding us into reflection. Acre is no longer under siege, but it still speaks, if we have the patience to hear. Echo 1, Lessons of Unity and Division. The story of Acre is, in many ways, a story of togetherness that was never quite whole. When we think of the Crusader army, it is tempting to imagine a single vast host, all marching to the same beat, all guided by one faith and one purpose. But the reality, as the echoes remind us, was far more fragile and far more human. Within the sprawling camp outside Acre's walls were men from nearly every corner of Europe. There were French knights with banners embroidered in gold thread, English archers hardened by years of skirmishes, Germans with their precise armor, Italians carrying both sword and mercantile ambition. They shared a cross-stitch to their cloaks. But beyond that, unity was tenuous at best. Pride ran high. Rivals eyed one another across the campfires. Commanders disagreed on strategy. And even kings bickered like brothers pressed too long into the same room. And yet, somehow they held. Not perfectly, not without quarrels or even violence among themselves, but long enough to see Acre fall. It was a kind of unity born not from harmony, but from necessity, like a rope fraying at the edges but strong enough for a time to bear its weight. That echo carries forward into every age. History is thick with coalitions that were awkward, messy, and imperfect, yet endured just enough to change the course of events. Think of later wars fought by uneasy alliances, of treaties signed between powers who trusted each other only a little. The lesson is not that unity must be pure to succeed, but that it can exist even in its brokenness. Victory does not always demand perfection. Sometimes it only requires persistence. But Acre also whispers a warning. The divisions that strained its camp never vanished. They only waited. When the moment of triumph passed, those cracks widened again, shaping the Crusades' failures that followed. And so we learn that division, once planted, has a way of growing back when vigilance wanes. Unity must be tended like a fragile flame, sheltered, guarded, fed with care, or it flickers out into smoke. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the scene. The great camp at twilight, thousands of tents glowing with the orange warmth of torches. From one corner, the chanting of priests. From another, the clash of voices raised in argument. A knight polishes his sword, muttering under his breath about an arrogant lord. A king sits in council, his advisors whispering conflicting counsel. And all around, men wait, not always in agreement, but bound by the common need to survive. That was their unity, thin, imperfect, but enough. And perhaps that is why this echo endures, because it feels familiar. We, too, live in a world where unity is rarely perfect. Families quarrel. Communities disagree. Nations pull in opposite directions. Yet again and again we find ways, sometimes clumsy, sometimes reluctant, to hold together when it matters most. Acre reminds us that even fragile unity has power. It can hold back despair. It can carry people through hardship. So let this echo speak gently tonight. Unity is not about flawless agreement or the absence of division. It is about endurance, about finding enough common ground to move forward. Even when pride bristles and trust feels thin, Acre's camp, with all its rivalries and tensions, still stood long enough to shape history. And in that, there is both a lesson and a comfort for us. Echo 2, the human cost. When we talk about Acre, it is easy to get lost in the numbers. Chronicles tell us how many ships came from Genoa, how many knights rode from France, how many months the siege dragged on. But behind every number was a heartbeat, and behind every heartbeat, a story. The echo of Acre is not just about strategy or walls. It is about the cost that ordinary people paid for the ambitions of kings. Imagine, for a moment, a young squire who had never traveled beyond his village. He arrived at Acre wide-eyed, thinking the crusade would be a grand adventure, a chance to earn glory. But the months stretched on, the food ran thin, and glory became nothing more than exhaustion and blisters. By the time the city fell, he was no hero, just another soul chained forever by hunger, fear, and loss. His name is not written in any chronicle. Yet he was part of the human cost. Or picture a mother within the walls of Acre. She had lived her life under the banners of Islam, raising her children in a city that bustled with trade and prayer. Then the siege came. Day after day, she watched from her rooftop as the campfires of crusaders burned outside, while inside the walls, supplies dwindled. She quieted her children when they asked why the bread had grown so thin, why the nights felt so long. She, too, is part of the story. Her suffering did not make it into the records of kings, but her tears were just as real. These lives remind us of something important. Wars are not only fought between armies, they are carried in the bodies of those who endure them. The men who dug trenches, the women who nursed the sick, the children who learned too soon what fear feels like. These were the silent casualties. For them, the human cost was not measured in triumph or defeat, but in the quiet ache of loss. And then, of course, there was death itself. The chronicles speak of thousands who perished, but numbers blur together. What matters are the details. A knight buried hastily outside the camp, his shield propped against a wooden cross. A merchant who succumbed to disease, leaving his wares rotting in the sun. A child gone from hunger before she could even understand why the sky was filled with smoke. Acres ground, if you could listen closely, would hum with the voices of the countless who fell. What makes this echo linger is not only the sadness, but the universality. Every generation has known some version of it. The human cause of war is not bound to the 12th century. It is timeless. Whether in Acre or in places closer to our own lives, the pattern repeats. Leaders argue, armies clash, and ordinary people bear the burden. And yet, there is something tender in this remembrance, because to recall the human cost is also to honor resilience. The squire who survived, weary but alive, carried a story home. The mother who endured found ways to keep her children safe even in hunger. The soldiers who dug graves still managed to whisper prayers. There is pain here, yes, but also an enduring spark of humanity. So, as you drift into sleep, let Acre's second echo rest gently in your thoughts. Behind every banner, every fortress, every chronicle, there were human lives, fragile, resilient, hopeful, and afraid. And it is their quiet endurance, more than the grand victories, that keeps history alive in our memory. Echo 3, shaping identities. When the dust of Acre finally settled, something larger than stones and banners remained, a shifting sense of identity. Wars did not only change borders, they changed the way people see themselves. The siege was not just about who held the walls, but about who belonged to which story, which memory, which faith. For the crusaders who came from distant lands, France, England, the German states, the experience of Acre wove itself into their very sense of self. A knight who returned home did not come back as the same man who had left. He had stood on foreign soil, fought under the hot Levantine sun, prayed in a language not his own. He had carried both fear and courage, both loss and survival. Even if he told no one what he saw, Acre had carved a mark upon him. In taverns and halls, he might speak of bravery, of banners raised high, but deep within, he also carried a memory of hunger, of sleepless nights, of watching friends fall. This mixture of pride and pain became part of what it meant to call oneself crusader. On the other side of the walls, identity was also reshaped. For the defenders of Acre, Muslim families, merchants, and soldiers, the siege became a story of resilience and faith. Saladin's shadow still lingered, even if he was gone, and his vision of unity had inspired many. Though the city eventually surrendered, its people did not see themselves as broken. Instead, they saw themselves as part of a larger struggle, one that transcended Acre's walls. For them, the memory of endurance became a bond, binding community to community, faith to faith. And then there were the people caught between, traders who spoke multiple languages, children born of intermingled cultures, women who had lived alongside neighbors of different faiths for years. For them, Acre had once been a place of connection, a port where worlds touched. The siege fractured that harmony, yet it also made identity clearer, sharper. Where before a man might have thought of himself simply as a merchant of Acre, after the siege he thought himself as a Muslim merchant or a Christian merchant, or sharpened lines that had once been blurred. But identity is never static. It is shaped not only by conflict, but also by memory. Long after the siege ended, stories were told and retold. In Europe, minstrels sang of the courage of kings and knights. In the Muslim world, poets and scholars reflected on the trials endured and the faith that carried them through. Each story, whether sung in a cold castle or whispered in a warm courtyard, added another layer to how people understood who they were. What makes this echo of Acre so powerful is its persistence. Even centuries later, the idea of the crusader and the idea of the defender of faith still ripple through culture, through politics, through identity. The events of 1191 were not left behind in the dust of history. They were carried forward, woven into the way nations and peoples thought of themselves. And yet, beneath the grand themes, we return to something very human. Identity was not only shaped by kings and chronicles, it was shaped by the baker who survived the famine, the soldier who limped home with a scar, the child who grew up hearing stories of both pride and loss. Their small, ordinary lives became the threads that wove the larger fabric. So, when you think of Acre, think not only of sieges and surrenders, but the quieter echo it left behind. The way it helped people decide who they were, where they belonged, and what stories they would carry. Identities forged in fire and famine, in faith and survival. Identities that would echo far beyond the walls of a single city. Lesson for the present. When we let the echoes of Acre drift gently toward us, across more than 8 centuries, we find they still carry whispers that feel surprisingly familiar. History, after all, is never only about the past. It is a mirror, sometimes dim and clouded, but always offering us a reflection of ourselves. The siege of Acre reminds us, first, of the fragility of certainty. To those who lived through it, victory seemed possible one day and impossible the next. Crops failed, supply ships sank, leaders quarreled, alliances shifted. In that fragile balance, entire armies held their breath. It is not so different today. When we place our faith in structures, political, economic, even technological, that can feel solid until suddenly they are not. Just as the people of Acre learned to live with uncertainty, so too are we reminded to hold lightly to the illusion that life is predictable. There is also the lesson perspective. Each side in the siege told a different story. For the Crusaders, it was a story of holy mission and hard-won triumph. For the defenders, it was a story of endurance and faith under pressure. Neither version was wholly false, and neither was wholly complete. To hear only one voice is to miss half the truth. This echo speaks softly to us now. In our own lives, in our own divided world, how often do we pause to listen to the other side of the story? The siege also teaches us about endurance in the face of long struggles. Acre was not taken in a day or even in a season. It was 2 years of waiting, watching, surviving, in that it reflects something deeply human, the slow, often painful march of perseverance. Whether through illness, grief, or the quieter struggles of daily life, we, too, are asked to endure. And though our battles may not be fought with sword and shield, the patience required, the courage to simply keep going feels timeless. There is, as well, a lesson in humility. The kings who arrived at Acre, Richard of England, Philip of France, brought with them the weight of crowns and the pride of nations. And yet, even they were shaped by weather, by hunger, by chance. No crown could command the sea to deliver more ships. No banner could summon the sun to rise brighter. The siege reminds us that human power, however mighty it appears, remains small in the face of nature and time. Perhaps this is why the story lingers. It humbles us, even as it fascinates us. But perhaps the most tender lesson is that of memory itself. Acre's walls have long since crumbled, but the memories endured. Sometimes in song, sometimes in scripture, sometimes only in silence. They remind us that what we live through matters, not only in the moment, but in how it is carried forward. Our struggles, our kindnesses, our choices, they ripple outward, shaping stories yet to be told. So, what do we take from Acre into the present? That unity is precious and fragile. That division, once sown, is difficult to mend. That endurance, though quiet, is powerful. And that humility may be the truest wisdom of all. As you let these thoughts settle, imagine the sea lapping against Acre's shore. Imagine the stones warmed by centuries of sun. Imagine the echoes, not as sharp cries of battle, but as soft reminders carried on the wind. History does not call us to relive its pain, but to hear its lessons, and to walk a little more gently because of them. And so the echo fades, not to silence, but to a soft hum that remains with us. The past, whispering to present. Remember, learn, and carry forward. And so, dear listener, we arrive gently at the close of tonight's journey. We began with the siege of Acre, a city of stone and sea, caught between two worlds and two destinies. We trace its struggles, its triumphs, and its sorrows, and we listen for the echoes it left behind. Echoes of unity and division, of human cost and resilience, of memory and identity that continue to shape us even now. As the curtain falls on that story, what lingers is not the clash of swords or the roar of battle, but the quieter truths. That people, whether in the 12th century or today, yearn for belonging, that they carry their hopes into uncertain times, that even in the darkest of nights, they search for meaning and leave behind memories, like lanterns glowing in the distance. It is a tender reminder that history is never truly past. It is always here, folded in the way we live, the choices we make, the stories we tell ourselves before sleep. Perhaps it is why these tales comfort us. They remind us that others, long ago, carried burdens, endured storms, and still found ways to leave light behind. So, as you close your eyes tonight, may the whispers of Acre and its echoes settle softly around you, like a blanket woven from centuries of memory. May you carry with you a little more gentleness, a little more humility, and a quiet reminder that our stories, yours, mine, and theirs, are all part of one long thread. And if tonight's story has stirred something in you, I invite you to join me again. In our next journey, we'll walk another forgotten path of history, listening for the voices that time has tried to silence. Together, we'll uncover not just what happened, but what it means then and now. Until then, rest well, dream kindly, and remember, the past is never lost. It simply waits, patient and quiet, for us to listen.